Let's move on now. German Chancellor Angela Merkel has accused Russia of eroding mutual trust with the West over the crisis in Ukraine. Merkel said Russia's actions have disturbed the West's eastern allies and they want security reassurances. Merkel was speaking to German lawmakers a day ahead of a NATO summit in Warsaw. The Western military alliance plans to finalize a revamp to counter what it calls an unpredictable Russia. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry has also warned that the Minsk peace deal will not bear any results unless real security is restored in Ukraine's volatile east.
Without real security in the Donbass, an end to the bloodshed on the contact line, the use of heavy weapons, and the blockading of the OSCE access, without that, Minsk is doomed to fail. Now, this was President Obama's message to President Putin in their phone call just yesterday, as they talked very frankly about the steps that are needed to be taken in order to move the process forward. And President Putin indicated that he does have a desire to try to see this process move forward, as does President Obama.
Kerry made the comments in a joint press conference with the Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko in Kiev. He added that Western sanctions against Moscow will remain until Russia implements the Minsk agreement. The West accuses the Kremlin of deepening Ukraine's crisis by backing pro-independence militias in the country's east. Moscow denies this, putting the blame on Kiev and its Western backers. To discuss that further, we're now joined by Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, who is the editor of Politics First, and he's joining us live now via Skype from London. Sir, thanks very much for joining us. We keep mentioning the Minsk agreement, but as others have said and pointed out, Russia's not actually mentioned in the Minsk agreement directly, or is not a party to it. So then why is everyone talking about Russia needing to implement something it's not even involved in?
Well, in a week which saw the findings of the Chilcot inquiry released, it's somewhat ironic and laughable that the West still projects itself as whiter than white, as an innocent party. What has Russia done that is so wrong in Ukraine? That's the question I would pose to Chancellor Merkel. Russia is faced with an extremely serious threat to its national security. NATO expansion in Eastern Europe, NATO's presence on Western borders in Europe is a very, very grave threat to Russia. And Russia responded to a pro-Western coup in February 2014 in Ukraine, which saw a democratically elected leader overthrown and the coming to power of hardline Ukrainian nationalists who are fervently pro-Western and who made it very clear that the Russian-speaking community in Ukraine are second-class citizens, possibly even third-class citizens. So Russia is defending its national security interests in Ukraine and also defending the Russian-speaking community, which numbers millions. And I always say this: how would America, for example, respond if on its borders, let's say Canada or Mexico, there was a Russian-led military alliance? The Americans wouldn't accept that, and so there is no reason whatsoever that Russia should accept NATO on its borders, and in particular in Ukraine, because should Ukraine ever be taken into NATO, which would be against the wishes of the vast majority of the Ukrainian population, Russian national security really would be facing a very perilous situation.
Right, so Dr. Papadopoulos, many people would point to the likes of Crimea, for example, rejoining Russia, and say that that shows Russian aggression. That's, of course, the Western term that is used. How do you react to such things?
Well, no. The people of Crimea responded decisively to the coming to power of ultra-nationalists in Kiev in February 2014. They saw the writing on the wall. They saw how those hardline nationalists in Kiev had decided that Russian as an official language in Ukraine would be banned. They saw how Russian and Soviet statues were being torn down. They saw how marauding right-wing paramilitaries were going across Ukraine, intimidating the Russian-speaking community. And so the people of the Crimea organized themselves and they held a referendum, and in excess of 90% of the population voted for reunification with Russia. And Russia respected the wishes of the people of Crimea, and by doing so, they prevented a potential bloodbath in the Crimea, which of course happened and is continuing to happen in Donetsk and Lugansk. And also Russia prevented Crimea, in particular Sevastopol, from becoming a NATO naval base, because we know very well that the Americans, NATO in general, had set its sights on the Crimea for many years, ever since Ukraine became an independent state in 1991. And by doing that, that effectively blocked American naval expansion in the Black Sea, which potentially could have been fatal for Russia.
Then as a final thought, then, I'm wondering, many people are, of course, warning that we are heading towards some sort of an escalation, some sort of even violence, a standoff. How do you feel about that?
If the West really wants to resolve the crisis in Ukraine, if the West really wants to improve its relations with Russia, it must do two things. It must respect Russia's legitimate right to national security, and secondly, it must relinquish its goals of trying to bring Ukraine into the West's orbit, in particular NATO. Now, unless the West starts to empathize with Russia, if it starts to put itself in Russia's shoes, then unfortunately the diabolical state of relations between the West and Russia, which is on account of the West's aggression, is going to deteriorate even further. And the world knows that NATO is no defensive organization. NATO is very much an offensive organization, which it has shown in the last 20 years that has not been lost in Moscow. And Russia will respond by all means necessary to ensure the security and stability of the Russian Federation, as any self-respecting country in the world would do.
Okay, we'll leave it there at that. But of course, as always, Dr. Papadopoulos, we of course appreciate you taking your time out to speak to us here at Press TV.